Graham, my friend, that was a really windy introduction. Yes, thank you.
JR sort of pleaded with me not to do that, but I did it anyway.
My main claim to fame is I married a woman from Amherst, Nova Scotia 44 years ago, and that pretty much sums it up. Well, about the birth thing.
Yes.
My mom has a different, or had before she passed away, she had a slightly different version of that story. But I will tell you that I don't know where, the internet knows everything, and it turned up on the internet one day, and I thought, well, that sounds kind of cool. And if truth be told, I was probably reborn in a canoe. I'm an accidental Canadian. Because my parents were in the UK and they flipped a coin to decide whether they would. My dad was in the Navy, and would they go to Rob Short, who was a Navy friend of my dad's in South Africa, or go with Simon Witt to Georgetown, Ontario, and they took the Emperors of Scotland to Montreal, and I became an accidental Canadian. But I was probably reborn in a canoe, in the sense, and I will say that line came back to haunt me in the craziest way amongst the Sami in northwestern Russia. I was in the Kola Peninsula, and I was traveling around the world for circling the midnight sun. You didn't even ask me about this, Graham. Just tell me to be quiet.
No, we're loving this. Yes. I'll circle you back if I need to.
We're in a meeting of elders, Sami elders, in a place called Rosseau Lake in northwestern Russia, over the border from Kirkenes, Norway. Took the bus. Gail was there, my wife, and these elders are sitting around the table, and they're talking about, I'm asking them about climate change, and they're talking about cultural decay, burying the last syllables of their land nuanced language, which had been driven over with tanks by the Russians, as Canadians had driven over the traditions of Inuit and Dene and North. And my host, Anna Prokova, who was this amazing Sami lawyer, she said, James, tell them about being born in the canoe. I said, well, that's not true. And she said, no, the part about being reborn. And so I told them that, but she said, these people at the table were so depressed about who they were as Sami that she wanted to incite them to rethink who they were. And the idea that you could somehow be reborn was an idea. I think it probably flopped spectacularly through a translator, but yeah, it's amazing. The internet knows all, and it actually spreads into the Cyrillic alphabet of Russia, which is a whole other story.
See, this is the thing about JR, and here's my sense, is that here he is in Russia, talking to elders about climate change and cultural decay. And my sense is, as you say those things, that you actually quite often find yourself in those kinds of situations. And, as we talk about this idea of rebirth, I'm just wondering about that concept. We all can identify where we're born, but what are the experiences that brought us back to life? And does that start to get to the core of what drives you to be out there in the way that you are so frequently?
Out of control, yeah. Although when I'm writing in the winter and moping around the house, I get up early at 4:44. I don't use an alarm clock. I love that time of day, but if it's a long winter, and it's been a pandemic and a long winter, and I've been working hard on some books, but I do spend a lot of time away, which is made possible by my wife Gail and family. She knows that this is necessary, just like I know that horses are necessary for her. But I will say that this particular winter, I haven't been very many places, and I believe she suggested just before I came here, isn't it time I went somewhere? Got places to go and people to see, you're in the way. Yes, I love you too. But coming here, I can tell you that, the energy that was radiated in Tasha's musical classroom today by the people who turned up for that, and just the energy in this place is amazing from the young people who are here, which feeds me. But as I've said several times, I really am quite overwhelmed by the impact of the smell of this environment. The fresh water, watching the ice disappear over these 2 days, I mean, it's a gift. And getting attuned with the cycles of nature, sitting near a 100-year-old tree that has seen the entire march of history, recent history, the last 100 years, knowing that tree that we're breathing, that tree probably has molecules of air that was breathed by your grandma in the ticket booth here, and also by indigenous people going back to the 19th century. But those rhythms of nature, which are close here, right? The falling away of the spring, the arrival of open water in summer, and the bubbleheads on the water, and I don't know, you can see the sky here, and that is a form of energy that I think just keeps me going. And I don't know if this is getting too sappy, but one of the things about being apart a lot of the time in a relationship, of course relationships go up and down, of course, like everything does, I think they have to. But one of the things that my wife and I share, even when the moon's upside down and I'm in Antarctica, we look at the same moon. And that's so kind of reassuring in a way, in the face of tumult and chaos and injustice and outright stupidity when it comes to the kind of things that are happening in the political realm in our country and elsewhere. Those rhythms of nature really do fire in my step. And I had to have a nap, Graham, before we came here.
I'm so sorry about how we packed your
I'm not
2
even a
days,
man
James.
anymore. But I will leave here with a spring in my step because of the place and because of the people.
It's beautiful.
Woohoo!
So, I'm actually suddenly a little grateful that my wife is not here tonight, because I will definitely steal that line. We look at the same moon. And here's the thing also. So this seems like it is a magical week, as the season turns so abruptly, as you so poetically have captured. But here's my thought, is that you could have been here last week when it was miserable and we had an ice storm, and you would have drawn us to the same magic in its own way. And this is actually, if I can just share a little bit, this is my first memory of JR. I was lucky to meet JR this past summer on a ship that was circumnavigating Newfoundland. And JR, and we would go out in the day and we'd have sometimes these harrowing but spectacular experiences on the high seas, seeing icebergs and puffins and beautiful fjords. And what would happen at the end of the day quite often is we'd come into this assembly hall kind of like this on the ship, and JR would offer this kind of poetic synthesis that sort of captured the day and brought the magic back to us in a very lasting way. And is that part of what compels you to, James? And what is this? This is kind of jumping all over, but I'm really interested in this intersection between your exploration and your artistry, whether that's music or your writing.
I think one of the reasons for sure my life is lit by the movement of my emotion. But I do like to sit still sometimes and thoroughly enjoy that. But I thought a little bit about why I keep going to these places and making things with what I find. And part of it, I think, has to do with being an accidental Canadian. I feel kind of I feel obliged. Both my mom and dad are passed now, but they lived long, happy lives. My mom got cranky toward the end. But I loved her, and first time I saw her cry was, she was always, she's a dour Scot, but always sort of emotionally invested in the exit from her family and her place where she was born in Kemney, Scotland. But she always, I learned as we lived together, and I grew and she grew, that she was really felt guilty about that, about leaving home. Her 5 brothers and her mom and dad. But I first went to the north in the mid 70s, and I came home with a homemade plant press. I was using my newly minted BSc from Queen's University to build buildings for Esso. It was a bit of a tramp, really, too. That was to pay for my first Arctic canoe trip. Turns out work as a biologist didn't pay very well, but yeah, slamming metal buildings together in the 20 midnight sun was better. But I had this little plant press that I made out of cardboard boxes from outside the northern store in Inuvik. And I think I might have used an old belt to tie it together. But I just found some, river beauty and the 3 kinds of heather that you find on the heath around the Inuvik, and some of the other flowers, mountain avens and bladder campion, and the beautiful flowers. And I had hunks of heather, which is so covered with wax. It's a pretty dry environment, the tundra. Who knew? But they actually burn it green, the Inuit do, to cook, make tea and stuff. But I had these chunks of heather in this little plant press, and I took it home because I always take my mom a rock. I took my mom a rock. I got them back when she died. My sister said, "You get those out of here." But I gave my mom the plant press, thinking it was just, it's just a thing, just something. My mom opened it and burst into tears, and I'd never seen her cry. And why was she crying? It was the smell of the tundra that smelled like the backside of Benahee when she walked up there. And so in answer to your question about sort of responding to what is seen at the ends of the earth, I guess it's almost like it might be an impulse. It's also something of an obligation. It's also really fun. And also, just like this, I will take this little performance with me to my grave. Just sitting in front of the kids this morning, they thought they were coming to some kind of benign encounter with some idiot who showed up here, The teacher thought he was all right, and okay, so he plays the guitar, big hairy deal. And I said, right. Here's a story about writing a song last summer. Okay, fine. Now here's the deal. We need an opening act for tonight. Who's in? And it was slow, wasn't it? But eventually, I think everybody was in, and it came along. And the chance that it could fail is where I love to be. Mm-hmm. I love to be, that's why I love to write, because it can crash and burn spectacularly. But when it works, that's a feeling that I can't describe. And I tried, and a lot of stuff is beyond words, but it's also a challenge to try to find words without being too purple about it, not using too many adjectives. And that is an ongoing game. It's a craft to try to evoke places that people will never be able to go.
There's a lot to unpack there, JR. I just want to reiterate that. That's so beautiful. The chance that it can fail is where I want to be. And I think we can circle back to that as we find our way into conversations about young people and education. And I think that idea sits sort of at your ethos of learning and experiential learning and outdoor education. You've also offered a nice segue, I think, into Ice Walker. And I'd love to chat about Ice Walker if we can. But before we get into some of the choices of the book and the unique narrative and the story of a bear and the story of ice, maybe you could provide some context and some of the experiences that sort of led you to the writing of this particular book in this particular way.
Sure, and I'm so glad that those particular two books are on the table, and I do appreciate Rah independent bookstores. And I'm looking forward to being there tomorrow morning. If you want to have coffee in Huntsville tomorrow, come on over to Cedar Canoe Book. Great name. So Circling the Midnight Sun was supposed to be a book that would take a year to go around the world. I wanted to put a human face on climate change. Seemed easy enough. Michael Palin from the Monty Python had been around the equator. That was okay. But he did a book and a series or a television thing called Pole to Pole. Did any of you see that? Where he went from the North Pole to the South Pole down the 37th line of longitude. Just a crazy trip. And I thought, I've spent nearly 40 years in the north of Canada. Maybe it's time to meet the neighbors. And so I thought, well, if I go to the Arctic Circle, 66.6, and turn right, you should always run towards the rising sun. I thought it would take a year, and then I thought I'd sit down and write a book about it. That would take a year, bang, bang, the book would come out. Well, the journey took 3 years. One of the first things I figured out is Michael Palin must have had a suitcase full of cash. Because when you hit the ground in a country which speaks a language you don't speak, you need two key people. You need a fixer who is a person of influence in that realm. They're not easy to find, and there are a lot of people who pose in that category, but you've got to find them. And then you need a translator. And John Gallant, who's a friend of you, any of you read The Tiger? Anyway, he went into Russia to look at Siberian tigers with a friend of his who happened to speak Russian, and the two of them were like Thelma and Louise. They had this incredible adventure. He wrote an incredible book, but I was so envious that he had a translator, because when you have to hire a translator, there are two kinds of translators in my pea brain. There's one that sort of hears the words and translates them word for word, which are basically no use at all, because they're the other kind of translator who listen and then tell you what the person is saying, not in the same words. You may remember in Never Cry Wolf, there's a great scene where Richard, who's playing Farley Mullet, is doing something stupid, and the elder looks at him and just kind of yells at him in Inuktitut, and just is going on, and Farley looks at the interpreter and says, "What did he say?" And the interpreter smiles with one tooth missing and he says, "Good idea." Anyway, getting onto the ground was expensive, but anyway, it worked 3 years. But what happened between 2012 and 2015 is a growing awareness of climate change and a decreasing appetite for books about climate change. People got really tired of being hectored about how we should live our lives differently. And so the next book with my Phyllis Bruce, God bless her, Gail calls her the other woman. I've known Phyllis, I've been working with Phyllis longer than I've been married to my wife. Gail calls her the other woman lovingly, but her favorite two words are lose this. I always need to mention that. Lose this. But she said, look, we can't do another climate change book. You're really going to have to rethink this. And that's where Ice Walker came from. It was sort of saying, well, what are we going to do that's different? And I said, well, and we just noodling, talking with Kevin Hansen, the publisher of Simon & Schuster, who's a really interesting, smart book guy. I love that. I mean, I've worked in the university and I've worked in the publishing world. The universities tend to be sort of turned inward, and that has its joys and trials. The publishing world tends to be turned outward, and I love that about the publishing world. They're very tuned in and very market-oriented. They're very backward with their market orientation. But the idea that we could make I could write a portrait of humanity around my debt to one particular polar bear, who I felt guilty about, who I'd worked with in the 1970s.
This is Huxley.
Abandoned Huxley. That book is dedicated to Huxley. And it was a super high risk. I mean, I have the vice grips of positivism, and if you're a little girl thinking, what on earth does that mean? I was trained as a scientist, which teaches you to think certain kinds of information is really important. Facts, figures. But in order to write creatively, you need to take those vice grips off, and you need to think like a poet. And that's, I married a beautiful woman who's an English teacher and loves language, and she has taught me so much about the release of the tyranny of the scientific method and that kind of thing, which resulted in a tortuous process. It takes a long time to write a skinny book, Graham. And so I love it.
So one of the things you said, and I love this, you said filmmakers aren't aiming so much at your head as they are at your heart. And I'm convinced more so than ever that we don't act on what we know, we act on what we feel. And I wondered what a book might look like that was aimed at somebody's heart first. I've done some digging, JR.
That's very cool. That's really.
And actually, I should say that this has had a big effect on us at Rosseau Lake College. These words, this is something that we put at the center of some professional development here. Just separating that, right? We think about education, we often think about the head. But what we're also trying to do, and maybe more importantly, is affect. And we are indeed aiming at the heart.
And God bless you for that. So, as I embarked on Ice Walker, it was called, I showed the kids this week the actual writing outline that I used in an English class here. It actually was written as Walking Ice. And in the wonderful collaborative process, it became Ice Walker. But as I was doing that, I mean, you get an advance to write a book, and it was a very generous advance to do that. But you've got to do other stuff. Being a famous Canadian writer that nobody's ever heard of, you've got to hustle. And so I write film scripts, and I work with a guy called Jason Van Bruggen, who is an amazing filmmaker, and with a young guy called Go Iramoto. One was on the north, and the other one was on canoes. And to get in tight with those creative forces, and they're force fields, these kind of people. And just to be able to behold and breathe the same air as them does some stuff. But they have, just like science sort of asks you to do something that's objective and replicable and linear and tight, these guys think in 3 dimensions. They're like holograms of force fields around them that include in their own head, when they're thinking about an idea, it includes music, it includes words, and it also includes images, which move people far more than any of that other stuff. And to that, I brought, the closest I got to what those filmmakers, their kind of view of the world, was this simplistic notion, but I believe it to be true, that if you're out there, as students are at Rosseau, learning through the soles of their feet, through the palms of their hands, through the seat of their pants, as much as through the front part of their head, knowledge that comes into these other places has to pass through your heart, on the way to your CPU. And that really brought to me a sense that I didn't want to teach you about polar bears at all. Although I am a walking encyclopedia about polar bear ecology and physiology and all that. I wanted to tell you a story that would engage you and ask you at the end of that book to consider that we are the bear. If we're going to get this world sorted out, we have to stop thinking that we, this is terribly articulate, I know, we have to stop thinking about us as independent organisms and start thinking about ourselves as people who were here before, knew far more about it than we do. And if one of the consequences, Don, of reconciliation is for us to set aside some of our chestnut beliefs about how the world works and what knowledge is, and instead embrace the teachings of the seven grandfathers and some of the circularity and beauty and integrated nature of indigenous thinking, indigenous knowledge, we will have been successful. I just hope that our indigenous people, including you, don't give the hell up in the meantime, because we've given you every reason to turn and walk away.
Thank you.
Wow. James, and just as you're saying that, and you're talking about how you're positioning us as the reader, and maybe asking us to consider ourselves as the bear. There's something Shakespearean about this, in the tragic sense. And we can see it coming a mile away. And there's that dramatic irony as a reader, where we're compelled to stand up and do something. And in the instance of reading a book, well, we're stuck in that moment. And we are incapable of, in that moment of reading, of doing something such as in a Shakespearean play. We can't actually leave our seats and save Hamlet from himself. So, is this part of the intention to position us that way? And I couldn't help but to feel that there's this parallel to climate change itself and the lack of action we take.
I have an image of Al Purdy, who came to a school I was teaching at, and I had lunch with Al Purdy, poet. I was teaching geography, math, science, and music. I'm having lunch. I'm just sitting at the staff room table. There's this iconic Canadian across the table. And I said, Al, what do you think about when the English teachers analyze the snot out of your poems?
Oh boy.
With greatest respect, Graham, I have the foggiest idea. So, I didn't read a book in high school. I read the Coles Notes because I like stockbrokers watch the market, I watched the teachers. I learned really early that you didn't do what the teacher told you to do. You listened to what the teacher had to say because that's what they wanted to hear back on the test. And then this alternate curriculum, which had to do with rafts and the Speed River and Boy Scouts and day camp and all of the things that have led to a life of adventure and exploration, which is kind of like they called it the poor scholars curriculum. That curriculum was the one that really mattered. But I've gone back to the books like Hamlet and have talked long and loud and listened to my wife who taught Hamlet for 30 years, and Shakespeare. And I wouldn't pretend to know anything about a Shakespearean tragedy, but you know what? If you are making that kind of connection, I'm humbled and I'm encouraged and I'm actually delighted that you're finding a parallel, because everybody has a different way in and a different way out. And in another book called Deep Waters, M.T. Kelly, who's a wonderful writer, and he reviewed the book in the Globe, and he called the founder of St. John's School a murderer. And I was really happy about that, because I'd never called Ted Byfield a murderer, but I had set up a set of circumstances, and he came at it as a lawyer, and he said, this guy's guilty of murder.
Wow. Because
of what happened in that school. So I'm not calling you a murderer, Graham, but what I am saying is and I've said this in the school and I'll say it here publicly, to come to a school who's decided to read one of your books and pass it around and do it in the classrooms has got to be one of the most heartening things for a writer who works in obscurity most of the time, and to see that people are selling them and buying them and reading them and asking questions you can't answer. I can't tell you that there's nothing better for somebody who writes for a living. Nothing better.
Beautiful. So I'm going to accept your criticism and try to come at this slightly simpler. And here's, with books in particular, I want to be careful here. Because I think I've had a similar experience, and I'm sorry you didn't enjoy Shakespeare in high school. And I didn't enjoy it either. And I think that school, without going too far down the school road here, it can give you every reason not to enjoy the books that the teachers hand you. And I think there's probably a commonality in that experience in this room. So, but we do get to come back to them eventually, and we do get to enjoy them and appreciate them maybe on a simpler level than the Billy Collins poem of tying it to a chair and interrogating it and beating the heck out of it like a with a hose, right? So what about that simple truth? So you know, there's this power in doing and learning through the soles of your feet, as you said. Do books have that potential? Can we have that experience through our reading?
I sure hope so.
Yeah.
And you each, I'm sure, will have a book or books that just draw you in and do that, and it's a visceral experience. So I'm rereading, it's funny, Gail and I had a conversation in anticipation of coming here about the books that informed who we were when we were young. And I told her about Gypsy Moth Circles the World by Francis Chichester, which was published. I got it in 1967. I had meningitis. I was in the hospital for about 12 weeks, St. Joseph's Hospital. Sister Baynard taught me how to play poker. I could shuffle cards lying on my back. I lost my train of thought. It's probably good as well.
Books, the power of books.
Yeah, Gypsy Moth Circles the World. I read it when I was 12. It's about an Englishman who sails around the world with one stop. Sydney, that's not Nova Scotia, Sydney, Australia. And I said, this was a powerful book, Gail. And she said, I don't know about him. I happened to be at my older sister's place in Puslinch, Ontario, last week. And there's the book. I said, did you bag that off Mom and Dad's shelf? She said, yeah, I took all the other books. Why didn't you take it? I said, well, I had other books. And I said, can I have that? And I've been rereading it. And what I'm conscious of now is the guy, he went around the world by himself when he was 67 years old. I'm 67 years old. I didn't appreciate that when I was 12. But now I'm thinking, holy mackerel. I think I'm living a reasonably adventuresome life. When was the last time you sailed a 55-foot double-masted sailboat around the world? Oh, and by the way, capsized and kept on going?
Yeah.
Not lately.
Yeah.
And that is soles of the feet, palms of the hands, sweat like a dog.
Yeah.
Reading it. But there are other books, I'm sure, that do the same thing. And that's when books really work. And the promise of books is that if you keep going, something's going to click and off you go. And we hope that for all of our little kids.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. And you brought up deep waters, and I do want to talk about deep waters if we can. And maybe there's a segue here. Bear with me. Let's see if I can do this. So books. Books do have that power to transport and bring us to other places and experiences. We've agreed on that. Canoes have that power. And I think you actually even said once, the canoe has the power to take a person from one world to the next. And I know you like to refer to Bill Mason, who talked about how canoes can be picked up. And that's maybe part of the power. It can go around the obstacles, as opposed to the motorboat, where you have to stop at the impasse. In a canoe, you pick it up, you go around, and you keep going. Deep Waters. This is a novel that people who don't know, it chronicles the Lake Temiskaming canoe tragedy of June 11, 1978, in which 12 boys and one leader from St. John's School out of Toronto lost their lives. And this is a difficult story for all of us. But you have said that as a teacher with a particular affection for wilderness canoeing, that you have always felt indicted to a degree by association with the tragedy of Temiskaming. Can you help us understand what you meant by that?
Yeah, plain and simple. I was working at Boyne River Natural Sciences School. Some of you may have been there. Toronto Board in Shelburne, closed now. Working with young people in canoes. And in June of 1978, actually my dad remembers, he said you were fiercely angry when that headline came out on the 13th of June in the Globe and Mail. And I did feel indicted by association because there are a lot of people who would say, you know, this is unacceptable. Big canoes should not be used for developing young people, like building knowledge and character in young people, when I knew in my heart from my own paddling and also from my early work as a leader and guide, that was a very powerful device for taking young people to the edge of what they know, whether it's about food or darkness or being away from home or new social situations or just hard work, the pain of cold. I mean, there's got to be suffering of some kind, and that's really good. And I knew all of that, but these people had somehow taken it so far with such just a total catastrophe. And I needed to deal with that because I didn't want people to throw the sort of the baby out with the bathwater of the tragedy. The baby being something that I think is a shining ideal. It's an ideal that's being lived here, and I think we are getting to a place. I mean, we have made. Temiskaming echoes through every hall of adventure learning anywhere in the world now. Australia, England, certainly the United States and Canada. People know about Temiskaming and how it happened, and there's been a lot of talk and scholarship and thinking about how to learn from that tragedy, and as such, some good has come from it. But yeah, Graham, I was maybe it was horror, but it was also straight up anger.
And it seems that, and you're touching on this, that there's a lot that one can identify that went wrong on that day. You, in your book, you talk about ill-designed and perhaps ill-designed and ill-fitting canoes, the unique conditions of that particular lake, the time of year, a general lack of expertise and training. But I think what comes across so strongly, more deeply, are the fundamental flaws in the ethos of the school. And that's where you sort of root it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So when adventure works really well, and this is where the artistry of teaching comes in, when it works really well, there's a difference between actuarial risk, which is the insurance statistics on all the ways you can get hurt or die or wreck property on it through an activity. And those numbers are there. And we know a lot about the actuarial. Like we know that 80% of property and personal damage accidents happen in the 45 minutes before lunch and the 45 minutes before dinner. We know that hiking is the riskiest thing of all, not canoeing. Rafting has the highest injury rate, that's person-to-person collisions. We know a lot about the actuarial risk of getting hurt or dying. We need to stay away from that for sure. But then there's the perception of risk, and it's the artistry of teaching to create something that has a high perception of risk. It's wonderful. You'll pay attention to stuff very closely, at least I do, if you think you're going to die. So, not to put too fine a point on it, on a canoe trip, it would be really nice, at some point on that trip, everybody thought they were going to die from a different cause. Knowing that all of the things that they were worried about were within a kind of constellation or range of possibilities that might get uncomfortable, but would never actually injure them or hurt them. But when it works really well, a student involved in that, they come up against the cold or the fear or the homesickness or the the food that they don't like, or the absence of their cell phone, or whatever the rub is. They come up against that, and then they dig into their pockets to find the resources they need to rise to the occasion. And hopefully, and this too is the artistry of teaching, because you've done some preparation with training and that sort of thing, you've got the right safety equipment and all that stuff. They reach into their personal bag of possibles to go the extra distance, and they step into that problem of cold or whatever it is, and they succeed. And they get stronger, they get more compassionate, more humble, braver, whatever all those character competencies are. When I spoke to Ted Byfield, and if I'm getting a bit exercise,
And just so we're all clear, Ted Byfield is
was
the
the founder of St. John's School. I was just thinking, though, that on going out the door, Gail said, "Don't swear and don't yell at people when you get excited." How am I doing?
Doing great.
Ted Byfield, when I interviewed him after St. John's School, there's still one in Alberta that was running. He was living in Winnipeg, he was living in Edmonton, fancy house. And I said, "Ted, when adventure, what were you trying to do?" And I said, and I explained that when it works well, they dig into their bag of resources, their bag of possibles, and they get to a point, and they reach and they pull out what they need, and they step into the new learning. He said, "No, that's not what we're trying to do at all." He said, "Well, what are you trying to do?" He said, "Well, we like to create those places for sure. That's why we snowshoe 50 kilometers with 12-year-olds, turn their feet into hamburger. That's why we do these ridiculous canoe trips." He didn't call them ridiculous, that's me. But what we want to happen at the edge, said Byfield, is we want people to come to the edge. We want them to chafe against the difficulties. We want them to reach into their bags of possibles, the resources, the character traits that they bring to the uncomfortable experience. And he said when it works really well in the St. John's way, they don't find what they need. That's what we really want, because it's only then that the boys will throw up their hands and say, "God have mercy." And God showed no mercy on Lake Temiskaming that day. And I think, I didn't call Ted Byfield a murderer for that. I called him a murderer for another thing that had happened on the snowshoe. But anyway, I'll calm down a little bit.
No, that's okay. Yeah. And, as we think about any three of those St. John's schools in the 1970s, and the outward appearance, the long snowshoeing journeys, the epic, really crazy canoe trips, it might be easy as an outsider to characterize that as an outdoor education school. I get the feeling that you would contend pretty strongly that it wasn't one. Is that fair?
No, I mean, to put it in context, St. John's fell into a time, through the 60s, but it became particularly strong in Ontario, and that's when the Ontario School opened in the late 60s. In the late 70s. The Hall Dennis report had come out, which said you shouldn't be in straight lines anymore. You should be, you should get into circles, and you should hug more and tell stories. And they softened up schooling a lot. There were a whole bunch of young people who were not well served by that model, sitting in circles on carpets. I'm not denigrating that. I'm just saying that there was a shift in policy in Ontario and elsewhere. And so when St. John's came along and said, 3 R's, little corporal punishment thrown in, these kids are going to swab the kitchens, they're going to make the food, they're going to do that sort of stuff. And so parents bought into that. But what I will say is this: is it an outdoor education school? Yeah, they wanted to make it tough and hard. But what's really interesting, as I talk to survivors, is that they said the snowshoeing and the canoeing were so far away from anything we could comprehend vis-a-vis risks. They were so hard. that they didn't even register. They said, selling honey and chickens door to door. That was really, really hard too, but it was in a realm. It was really hard, but we really enjoyed that, and that was an experience a lot of St. John's boys told me about. To make money, they would grow chickens, and then they would go door to door, and they said to be able to cold call on the door, and they drop them off, and they just visit neighborhoods in the Etobicoke, and like drop them off, like, I won't make that comparison. Drop them off to sort of proselytize the neighborhood with honey and chickens. They said that's really hard because what they had to do is they had to stand there in their uniform and they had to say, hello, I'm so-and-so from St. John's School. And somebody said, oh, well, hello, what's St. John's School about? And they said, oh, well, and they said that was really hard, but it was really good. And then it turns out that a lot of people in St. John's School ended up in sales. A lot of people in St. John's School did not end up becoming snowshoe outfitters or canoe guides. I'm just saying.
Well said. I want to ask you about Peter Knight. And Peter Knight missed the canoe trip because of a last-minute decision made by his father. And can you tell us how you came to know this story? I think it was really interesting. It was late in the game in terms of the publication of the book. And then also to provide some insight into this decision that Dad made and where that decision came from. I think it's really important.
The dad had a dream that his son was going to die. And he acted on the dream and took his kid out, like at the 11th hour, like the 11th hour and 59 minutes. Dragged his kid out, Peter out. My wife Gail's an animal communicator. She lives in the energy realm, and my work with Indigenous people throughout the circumpolar world has taught me that you got 27 letters after your name. You have no corner on the truth, and that the truth dwells in amazing places. And the fact that this father had a dream and trusted it enough to pull his kid out, this premonition. And what's that about? He had a dream. We can talk a lot more about that, but it's almost a different conversation. How did I come across Peter Knight? By then, there was a guy from CBC who was trying to write a book about St. John's School, and he basically found all the survivors before I did, so a lot of them were either reduced to psych ward cases as a result of the interrogation from this other guy, or they just stonewalled me. But Peter, and you may have more detail than I do, Graham, being the owner and Lochtel of Rosseau Lake.
No,
you may have more detail than I do, but as I recall, it was somewhat serendipitous. But I was so glad to find Peter, and so ultimately surprised. And I think I put a letter from the dad or somebody in the back of the book. Mm-hmm. And it really was after the fact. But it really did kind of open for me and find a way out for this book to bring in the other in a way that would leave. Because as a writer, you have to think, you're shaping an experience for the reader. What is the reader going to experience? And I needed to find a way out and to leave an impression. And that's only what you guess at that point. But yeah.
Wow, it's haunting, you know, and I say that as a father.
Yeah.
You know, I'm inspired by this father, but I'm scared. You know, this is a man who followed his intuitions, his premonitions, and with a decisive decision. And I know you have a good Hamlet story about this particular book, but there's something about this to be or not to be, to do or not to do, that terrifies me. And, you know, it's that question of, me personally, would I have the courage to make that decision based on a premonition? I'm not sure. And maybe this is a nice way to circle back a little bit to the idea of the theme of climate change and ice walker, and this idea of action versus lack of action, and the courage to do or to not do.
So Gail and I have two daughters. They're 37 and 35, and they're making their way in the world. They're fledged and bringing us joy and pride and grandchildren. But what was our advice to them? And I always took Gail's lead: trust your instincts. Like when they were heading out in the world, and the world was a very scary place, particularly for parents who have some presumably more knowledge about some of these contexts the kids are going into wide-eyed, but trust your instincts. And I think systematically, when it comes to how we know, Benjamin Bloom, in Bloom's taxonomy said, has anybody been to teachers college? There are three boxes of human knowledge. There's the cognitive box, which is thinking. There's the affective box, which is feeling, and then the psychomotor box, which is physicality and craft and stuff. Well, I think that's just a crock. That's just so narrow. We know in so many ways. And intuition and instinct is something that we are not in the habit. It never makes its way into curriculum. There's always a bit of verbiage at the front. One of the reasons why I think this kind of curriculum with an outdoor emphasis and with a connection to nature is important, because there are all kinds of collateral learnings in a social context of a school or residential context, even the day kids who come in here. But if you are embracing the social context of the school through mentorship and all the different ways, teams and coaching and all that sort of stuff, what you're telling people, and setting that in the context of Kurt Hahn, who had a much broader sense than designers of industrial training schools about what it meant to be an educated person. Hahn said you need to be fit. By that he meant you need to be physically fit, mentally fit, spiritually fit. Oh, and yes, intellectually fit. But he said you need adventure, you need risk, you need uncertainty. You absolutely need that. He said you need craft. You need to be able to make things with your hands, and you need to be able to have a relationship with a master who knows how to do that craft, so that you can. That's another set of skills. And finally, he said you need compassion, and you have that here too, which means service to the community. But that's a much broader. Hahn was concerned about the moral decay of youth in the 20s and 30s in Germany, and had started a school called Zalem, and then jailed by the Nazis, eventually ended up in northern Scotland, created Gordonston School, and that whole story goes on, and ended up creating the Duke of Edinburgh Awards, the international school system, the Outward Bound, and on it goes. But getting back to Peter Knight, isn't it an amazing thing that his dad, I don't know anything about his dad, I never talked to his dad, but isn't it an amazing thing that a guy who was schooled in a 4x4 Ontario school system had the wherewithal to listen to a dream?
Amazing. Okay. I want to talk about the canoes, because I know the 4 canoes that were there that day on June 11th, 1978. I think you were under the impression for some time that all 4 of those canoes had been destroyed.
Yeah, I wrote it in the book. I had great evidence that they were all destroyed for fear of litigation, as you'd expect. Makes sense. Various stories of pilots going, breaking them up and burning them.
But then, somewhere along the line, you suddenly learn that there's still one in existence. Can you tell us a little bit how you came to know that boat?
So when Deepwaters was published, I started getting phone calls from people who called to give me a piece of their mind. They said, it's none of your business. You shouldn't do this. They were mad. They were St. John's people, and it was a fairly regular thing. But this one night, probably a Friday night, about 9:15, the phone rings, and there's a woman on there who said, are you James? I said, yeah. She said, well, you don't know me, but you know who I am. And I don't know you, but I know who you are. And I'm like, ooh. I'm thinking, yeah, we met 21 years ago, and we're going to have a child. Anyway, she said, and I have something to give you. And at that point, I thought, oh, it's a piece of her mind. This is St. John's related. And she said, no, I have one of the canoes.
Wow.
I said, well, how is that possible? Because I heard that all of the canoes were destroyed. And she said, no. This is Barb Graney is her name. She and her husband Andy went to Ville Marie, Quebec, ostensibly to identify their son Davy, who had died. And they asked the school at the time for one of the canoes, the canoe that Davy was in, the Père Lalemant. They're named after Jesuit priests. And they took that canoe and they put it in a garage at 7 Harris Street, right over in Port Carlisle, just over here. Probably some of you maybe lived there, I don't know. You may know the address where the grains were. It was a 19 by 19 garage. The canoe's 22 feet. It was kitty corner, and it was a classic cottage midden. I think there was a picnic table in there, but happily they had thrown shutters on top of the canoe that the raccoons who lived in the place used as a latrine. So the canoe itself was protected.
Wow.
Used one day, brand new. Used one day. And that happened. I said, Barb, 27 years after the fact, why did you keep this canoe all this time? She said, well, it was the last place Davy was. And she said, I'd like to give it to you. And I said, I can't possibly accept that canoe, but I can help you give it to the Canadian Canoe Museum. It's a difficult story, but it's an important canoe. I said, I think we can organize that. And she said, the other thing is I'd like to paddle in it. And so I went up one time to see the canoe and to meet her to do the paddle. And she couldn't get it together to come up to the cottage to do that. And I called her and said, Barb, I'm here. And she said, well, if you want to see the canoe, just break in. So I did, and the neighbors came and interrogated me, as good neighbors do. And I saw the canoe, but eventually Barb turned up and we went paddling. And the canoe is in the Canadian Canoe Museum, and actually it's going to be, as part of the exhibits at the new Canadian Canoe Museum, marking it not only to remember the people who died, but also to have it there as a sea change. But that was a pretty powerful moment. I'm convinced now there is no such thing as an objective fact, right?
Yeah.
I mean, reliable people can tell you stuff. I'm not a lawyer, but I know now, like the reliable people said they're all the story. They're not the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The last place. And so now it's going to be in the Canadian Canoe Museum.
Yep.
And it's part of an exhibit that's called Pushing the Limits.
Pushing the limits, and this is about pushing the limits too far. It's part of the museum where you're going to find Olympians and Don Starkel, who went with his sons to the mouth of the Amazon from Winnipeg.
Wow.
But I do remember looking at Barb Graney. I did a documentary for CBC Radio called One Blue Canoe. But I realized in looking in Barb Graney's eyes, I had no idea. I'd written a whole book about this thing. Spent 3 years of my life studying this, and looking at her, could never comprehend the grief that she carries with her, that she still carries with her.
Okay, so this canoe, Barb refers to it as the last place that Davy was alive. And I know that this has turned into the title of a song that's a part of this exhibit that you have been co-writing with the great Paul Mills. How are you feeling right now, JR?
Well, I tell you this, I'm feeling fine, and if we've got time, I'd be happy to sing you this song. But I'll just tell you this. I wrote a book about this tragedy, about the whole idea of risk and all this sort of stuff, and looking in Barbara Green's eyes, I realized I didn't have a clue. Not a clue. So I happen to be doing, with Paul Mills, who's an amazing musician, Stan Rogers producing, Ellie McMaster's producer, he produced Sharon Lois and Bram. He's a musical icon, Order of Canada. He's a friend, and I told him about this thing, and I said, Paul, you know, tragedies, the Edmund Fitzgerald, the wreck of the 97, they all have songs about them. Can you help me write a song? He said, sure. And so that idea that this was the last place her son was became the foil for the song. And if we've got time, I'd be happy to.
I think we have time.
It goes something like this. Willing hands make way near the end of spring on the sun-bright face. Up to Miskaming, this canoe Lalamont, it was one of 4 that took 31 souls to a rocky shore on cold water. Work and pray, pray and serve was the school strict code. Characters forged on a rocky road. Take your swats like a man from a master's hand. Follow blind and you'll get to the promised land on cold water. 7 hours way up, one boy's had enough. No one sees that the lake is getting real rough. Get to work, mama's boy, just get on with it. 20 strokes off the shore and the group was all split. One blue canoe with the smallest of boys lagged in the wind and the waves and the noise. Calls to the others to wait when unheard. A broadside hit and it's overturned in cold water. The other canoes turned around to help, but they pitched and they dumped in the growing swell. Panic-stricken heroes did the damnedest things. Hymns were sung into Miskaming's cold water. Some couldn't swim, but they calmed them down. A keyhole vest wouldn't let you drown. But in the spring of the year, that's not the point, because cold creeps into every joint. When the day was done, 18 survived, asking on shore why they still were alive. 13 dead, put their faith in God. They didn't have a chance against earthly odds in cold water. We believed that adventure would do them no wrong, that the risks of the wild would make our boys strong. If they'd run to the morning, they'd outstride the sun. And that's how it went until all came undone. Yes, this boat they call Lalamond is many things. A cradle, a crucible, the last place of peace. Yes, the last place. Last place. Oh, the last place of innocent grace. On cold water, willing hands made way near the end of spring. On the sun-bright face up to Miskaming, this canoe Lalamont, it was one of 4 that took countless souls to a rocky shore on cold water.
James told me that, I think he said something like this, that the best writers are songwriters. Thank you for that, James.
Thank you.
Okay, James, you've sort of given us the best place to end in some ways, but there's so much about you that gives us hope. And it's your belief in the young people, it's your pedagogy, it's the way that you live with enthusiasm and joy and passion. There's something for all of us in that. So I feel like the perfect way to end here is to just get some advice from James. And as we look, as we look to some of the challenges we're facing as a humanity, Mother Earth, what can you say to us? How can we help? What can we do? How can we be in some way assured that we can fix this?
I don't think you can. I don't think some of the things that we have done that has created the Anthropocene, I don't think a lot of that is fixable. But is there a reason for hope and optimism? Both of which I think are choices, personal choices that you put together. And in my case, hope and optimism, and it's not Pollyannaism, is fueled by activity and action. What can we do? Keep doing what you're doing here. Risk, for heaven's sake, needs an advocate. Uncertainty is where real learning begins. The boys at St. John's School showed me that if their masters identified a moral North Pole, you've done the same thing, and look at them here. You've got to be thoughtful, persuasive, adventurous, creative, etc., etc., etc. You lay all that out there, and you create activities that will create edges for your students to cross, to get into some of the learnings that will take there. And gee, it was cool this morning at the end of the assembly when you actually honored people for doing things in those categories. What a novel idea. It doesn't happen in public schools. So keep doing that. But one of the things that the St. John showed me, that you can identify the moral North Pole, whatever it is, some good to get there. But if you drag the kids there, or push them there, or cajole them there, if they don't get there under their own steam, and you may have noticed this as a parent, the real learning is the learning that the child or the learner makes. They make the decision to make that step. You can do all kinds of things to make it possible to help them make that step, but they have to make the step. And that's what you're doing here. It works a lot of the time. It won't work every time. And one of the young people here asked me, she said about, of all the things you could do, what should I do? And I said, just pick one thing and put your heart in it. I don't care what it is. Tidy up how you buy your groceries. Go volunteer somewhere. Go to the ends of the earth. Join, the Suzuki Foundation. Look at the Sustainable Development Goals. Go make a pile of money in the IT field and give the money to good causes. I don't care what you do. Just don't do nothing. Just do something. So I keep going to north. I mean, last week I was at 2 weeks ago, minus 50 in Tuktoyaktuk with some friends from South Africa who I've been mentoring. And it was hard, cold, and it was fun and interesting. But one of the reasons I keep going to the ends of the earth is I have this longitudinal study from the mid-70s to now. And in the mid-70s, you saw a lot of people, Inuks and Dene, who weren't proud to be who they were. But that's changed over the last 40 years. And I'm still, if I can, I am working with young people whenever I can, and I get the opportunity to do that. And I have my CPICs up to date. You never did ask me.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It's my one job, wasn't it?
But in the north, the pride that is coming back to young Inuit and young Dene who are taking charge. I mean, some of them are now lawyers and deputy ministers and ministers, and it's coming along. But when you see the pride and the language in Nuktutut and Nuinaktun is coming back, and Wichin and some of the Athabaskan languages are coming back, and there's pride there. And you may have seen facial tattooing in the young women whose grandmothers or great-grandmothers might have had that. It's coming back, and it's in your face, and they're proud and happy. And that, I mean, in addition, so me going north, the motion, that's what I'm doing to keep hope and optimism. But I tell you, the hope and optimism that comes out of the mouths of some of those, like my little friend Cheetah Charlie Gruben, who's I think 28. She's running the Hunter Trapper Committee in Tuktoyaktuk, and she gave the most amazing presentation to these South African people about erosion in and around Tuktoyaktuk and about the beluga harvest. These people were sitting there, you still hunt whales? Well, of course we do, it's part of who we are. And she just stared them down, told them about this. Yeah, we hunt whales. It's in the free, do you want some? You know, try it, it's great. That kind of optimism is kind of a double whammy in the sense that me acting to go and find out about that so I can amplify those voices that I hear that you perhaps would never hear because you're not, you have a real life and not a chaotic life like mine. But so I amplify those voices and I can bring those faces back and that sort of thing. But that's just straight up joy that I feel when I see Cheetah Charlie Grubin just fixing the world. And she's less than half my age, and I'm so proud. You know, I worked with her back in 2017 when she was even younger, but just as mouthy as ever, and just fantastically smart and irreverent, and I think, yeah, Tuck's in a good place because it's got Cheetah Charlie Grubin.
All right.
And there's a lot of Cheetah Charlies around, and there are a few Cheetah Charlies here too, and I've met them. I haven't met everybody, including the members of the still unnamed musical ensemble.